Hi, my name is Daniel Blackburn, and today we're going to talk about soil nitrogen, its bioavailability to plants, and its biogeochemical cycle. This is the first lecture of soil nitrogen in the course SWAE4401 Water and Nutrient Cycling in Soil Plant Environments. This is part one of soil nitrogen, and today we're going to talk about nitrogen bioavailability to plants and the biogeochemical cycle. In the next lecture, I will talk about how to manage nitrogen fertility for crops. All right, so let's give a quick introduction about what is nitrogen and its chemical behavior and the biogeochemical cycle, also about its importance to plant and the Earth terrestrial environments in general. So nitrogen is atomic number 7, molecular weight typically 14, but it has also some stable isotopes. Nitrogen 15 has quite high abundance on the environment. It's also stable, about 0.4%, and because we have some stable isotopes of nitrogen, it's much more easy to study nitrogen in the environment, trace how it moves in the environment. It's easier to study nitrogen than it is to study phosphorus, for example. Phosphorus does not have other stable isotopes. It has some radioisotopes, but the radioisotopes for phosphorus, they have quick decay on the environment, so it's hard to use it as a tracer. Yeah? So for nitrogen, the studies of nitrogen are facilitated by this fact, by its chemical nature, but also it's difficult because the type of transformations and chemical reactions that nitrogen has on the environment. So nitrogen is highly regulated by microbial activity, and also it has a very complex nature of chemical reactions. Yeah? A big array of different reactions that are happening. So if we think about nitrogen in plants, we see that nitrogen among the macronutrients, it is the one with highest abundance. It's the one that has the highest concentration in plant materials. In animal tissue, this is even higher because animals have more proteins than plants, and nitrogen is an integral part of the amino acids and then the basis of DNA and RNA. So that's one of the reasons why nitrogen is so abundant. And because it's a constituent part of many plant molecules, this is why the plants need it so much. So this is here showing that the main role of nitrogen is that it's part of the amino acids and therefore proteins. And because it's part of proteins, it's regulating all the biochemistry in plant cells. And also the information storage, the bases on the DNAs and RNAs, these are the, you have nitrogenated bases. So these bases are the ones that carry the information. So nitrogen has a big role on this in both the DNA and RNA, but also as an integral part of all molecules that are composed by amino acids. So in the environment, we can say that nitrogen is also really relevant, not only because plants need it in high amount for growth. One of the main reasons that we are so concerned about nitrogen is that in soil environments, it's not very abundant. Usually, nitrogen is at low concentrations in soil environments. So plants usually starve for nitrogen in most soil environments. Microbes also starve for nitrogen. And nitrogen fertilizers, depending on the cost of energy, nitrogen fertilizer becomes a very costly input for crop productions. And about it is the biggest constituent of fertilizers. What you apply in highest amount for crops is nitrogen. And the next thing that we are very concerned about the nitrogen use for crops is that when we apply nitrogen to soils, we tend to lose it in quite high amounts, either as a volatilization or denitrification to the atmosphere, or we lose it to the aquifers. And when we lose it through erosion or leaching, it becomes a source of environmental pollution and eutrophication of waters. So this is what we see. If you have here in different catchments, they're nearby. If one water course or reservoir is receiving nutrient pollution, it becomes highly increase the population of algae, and this algae bloom is causing oxygen deprivation for fish, and that's called the eutrophication of waters. This is what we discussed before in the phosphorus lectures. So nitrogen together with phosphorus is one of the main sources of nutrient pollution for surface waters. So we have to be very careful about how we manage fertilizer in crops because of this environmental concern of the eutrophication of surface waters. In plants, the nitrogen deficiency is usually seen as a yellowish color, lower growth, very thin stems, and but mainly you will see it as a chlorosis, overall yellowish color on the plant. Here showing another image for tomatoes, and then we will see again here that we see that nitrogen deficiency is usually seen as a very pale yellowish color on leaves. Here also showing on the lettuce, we will see also nitrogen showing with a very smaller growth of the leaves and also a yellowish color. So in general, this is how you will recognize nitrogen deficiency, is that you have this chlorosis or yellowing of the leaves. Nitrogen has a very complex transformation on the environment, but this figure here gives you the simplified version of that. The biggest pool of nitrogen is on the atmosphere. It's the complete opposite of phosphorus. Phosphorus, the biggest pool is on the phosphate rocks and the sediments, whereas in nitrogen is the atmosphere. So N2 and the atmospheres represent the majority of the nitrogen in the Earth systems. This nitrogen moves naturally to the soil environment by biological nitrogen fixation, or also it can be transformed from N2 to bioavailable forms by lightning also. But these days, the biological nitrogen fixation is share part of the role of transformation from atmospheric nitrogen into soils with the industrial nitrogen fixation. We are using energy to fix atmospheric nitrogen into bioavailable forms of nitrogen using a process that will describe for you in a bit, the Haber-Bosch process. Once this nitrogen hits the soil, it starts to cycle. It can be absorbed, assimilated by plants, and the plants will fix this into amino acids. Animals will eat the plants, and this will be come back to the soil as organic matter and be decomposed and reassimilated, and it will cycle in the soil environment for a long time unless it's lost by denitrification or leaching into waters. So it can go to water environments by leaching and erosion, but it can also be denitrified. There are more complexity in the cycle than this, but for now we're going to leave it for the purposes of this course. I would just leave it like this. If you want to understand more the processes of nitrogen transformation in the environment, I really recommend you to go for the same lecture on the course of environmental soil microbiology, and then I will describe many other biological processes and transformations of nitrogen on the environment. But for the purposes of this course, I will just leave the simplified version of the cycle like this. So as I was telling before, the main pool of nitrogen on the environment is atmospheric nitrogen. Atmospheric nitrogen accounts for the almost all the nitrogen we have on the environment. So it's 4 billion gigatons of nitrogen. It accounts for 78% by volume of the atmosphere. So the air we breathe, actually, it's mostly nitrogen. Nitrogen is the carrier. But nitrogen in this form, in the N2 form, is very stable. It does not react with anything. Yeah, if you look at here, the N2 molecule, it possesses a triple covalent bond. This makes that this nitrogen molecule, it's really hard to make any chemical reaction with anything else. It's very stable. There is no free electrons to be shared with any other molecule here. And the other thing, it's very symmetric, so it's really hard for enzymes to grab this molecule and break it down. So nitrogen N2 is the main form of nitrogen in all the Earth systems. But it is not the only form of nitrogen on the atmosphere. We have also nitrous oxide, which has a very low abundance, 0.025%. And we are very concerned about nitrous oxides because nitrous oxides are a greenhouse gas, yeah, and then it has a very high global warming potential, 298 times the potential of warming the atmosphere as compared to CO2. Nitrous oxides is either formed by electrical storms, or it can be emitted from soils and waste through the denitrification process. A part of the denitrification process renders nitrous oxides, and another part renders back into the atmosphere. Also in the atmosphere you will have ammonia gases, which are a result of the volatilization of ammonium in the soil, and normally it will contribute a lot. It's a high concern for atmospheric pollution because it forms also fine particles in the atmosphere, particulate matter on the air. So also, people who study atmospheric pollution is very concerned about ammonia emissions from soil. We are concerned about the volatilization of ammonia because it's a very important source of nitrogen losses from the soil environment, and therefore lowering the efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer application to plants. From the atmosphere, this nitrogen can be deposited in soils, but the atmospheric deposition, either wet deposition or dry deposition, it can be important if the environment is really poor in nitrogen. Yeah? But if the environment is rich in nitrogen, this is a low contribution. It's usually on the range of 1 to 2 ppms. Yeah. The contribution from the atmosphere, whereas the contribution from other sources would account for more than 100 ppm. So this is kind of a low contribution. In Oman, you do not expect much of wet deposition because we don't have much rainfall. The dry deposition could account for some amount with the dust, but it's also you don't expect to have quite a huge amount of nitrogen atmospheric deposition anyway in Oman. The main sources of nitrogen to the environment are either the biological nitrogen fixation into soils or the fertilizer application that is a result of the industrial nitrogen fixation from the atmosphere. So the industrial nitrogen fixation was of very high interest because these nitrogen sources were used and still can be used as a source of explosives. Yeah, so if you want to, for the warfare in the First World War, there was a huge interest in obtaining ammonium. And normally this ammonium was obtained from salitre, and because of the sinking of ships and the problems with transport of salitre, there was a huge interest in start fixing atmospheric nitrogen. The first process described for atmospheric nitrogen fixation was really inefficient. It was the Birkeland-Eyde process. And this guy here in the photograph, Fritz Haber, was tasked in the efforts from Germany on the First World War to create a process for fixing atmospheric nitrogen in a more efficient way. And he created what is called now the Haber-Bosch process. Now it's Haber-Bosch because Bosch optimized that for industry application. But he was the one who envisioned the way of using catalysts to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So high temperatures, high pressures, and the presence of a catalyst, you can transform into ammonia. And then from ammonia, you can react that with different molecules, for example, with sulfuric acid, and you can create, for example, ammonium sulfate, or with CO2, you can create urea, for example. But the importance of this process, although the initial purpose of doing the Haber-Bosch process was for warfare, now because of that we can fix atmospheric nitrogen, the carrying capacity of the earth, the ability of the earth systems, the productivity of the soils nearly doubled. So the capacity that we have to produce food on the earth is nearly twice as much as we had before due to this process. It's a very important process, and it's due to this unintended consequences of this technology that we have the agriculture in the green revolution that we have today. So it's really relevant for society in general, all societies, to have atmospheric nitrogen fixation, although this was made for very ugly purposes in warfare. This Fritz Haber is a war criminal, by the way, brilliant chemist, but in a sense he was dealing with the worst type of chemistry as possible, poisonous gases for warfare, and also explosives using this process, the Haber-Bosch process. So if you want to know more about Fritz Haber, follow the links on these videos, and you will understand a little bit more about what is his role. He was a brilliant chemist, but with the worst of intentions, let's say. If you don't use fertilizer, if you're talking about natural environments, then the main source of nitrogen to these environments are the biological nitrogen fixation. So the biological nitrogen fixation, we owe it for bacteria. Bacteria are basically the sole source of nitrogen to terrestrial systems when you do not have fertilizer application. It's the majority of the nitrogen that comes in a soil environment in natural ecosystems. It's coming from this bacteria that carries the nitrogenase enzyme. The majority of these bacteria, they have direct symbiotic relationship with plants. The main genus is the Rhizobium bacteria, and they form this symbiotic mutualistic relationship with legumes. This relationship is really costly for plants. Plants need to provide this bacteria with a lot of carbon molecules, sugars, for this bacteria to be able to fix the nitrogen. If you look at this equation here, you will see the 16 ATP. 16 ATP is what it takes to fix one nitrogen molecule from the atmosphere. So it's a hugely energy costly reaction for the plant, and therefore this association of the plant using the energy from the sunlight, fixing it in available sugars, and giving these sugars for free for the plant, not for free because they interchange this, the ammonium that the bacteria will fix. So Rhizobium is the main genus responsible for atmospheric nitrogen fixation, but there are other genus of bacteria, other bacteria species carrying this nitrogenase enzyme also. It's the only enzyme doing this job in nature, the nitrogenase enzyme. The other main groups of bacteria that are doing this job also, cyanobacteria mostly in water environments. Cyanobacteria is also photosynthetic, so it's the only organism on Earth that can both fix atmospheric carbon and atmospheric nitrogen. So cyanobacteria are very special microbes that are also able to fix atmospheric nitrogen. For aquatic systems, these are the main source of nitrogen fixation. So if you see this green growth in your aquarium or in waters, many of these are not algae per se, but cyanobacteria. And the cyanobacteria, they have an essential role in the system because most of these systems are nitrogen deficient, and the cyanobacteria is able to fix atmospheric nitrogen. In the rhizosphere of grasslands, you also have an important role of Azobacter. Yeah, Azobacter can play also a big role as a free living diazotroph, yeah, nitrogen fixer microbe. So once this atmospheric nitrogen reaches the soil environment, this is absorbed by plants and microbes, incorporated into the organic matter. When this organic matter comes back into the soil, then it has to be cycled back into ammonium. And this process is called the ammonification. Yeah? And there are many enzymes in this process. The main one is called the aminotransferase enzymes. Yeah? Why do microbes do this, the ammonification? They do this because there is free energy. They do this as a source of energy. If you break down this molecule, this can be a source of energy. And the type of microbes that do this, they're called heterotrophs. They're degrading organic matter as a source of carbon and energy. But there are other enzymes like the urease also, or breaking down organic molecules that carry nitrogen. Nitrification process is the step which transforms inorganic ammonium in the soil into nitrates and nitrates. Yeah, nitrates and nitrates. So the bacteria that does this, there's a two-step process. The main bacteria that carry out this process, it's Nitrosomonas. Nitrosomonas oxidize ammonium into nitrate. And two important things in this process is that these bacteria are chemolithotrophic microbes. They use this inorganic nitrogen as a source of energy. But in this process, it also releases protons into the soil. So this is an acidifying reaction. So any ammonium-based fertilizer that you add to the soil will be acidifying. It's an acidifying fertilizer. So you have to be careful if you're in an acid soil. If you're in an alkaline soil like the ones in Oman, then this ammonium-based fertilizer is welcome because we have the pH being highly alkaline. So you want to use urea or ammonium-based fertilizer in a way that you can help the soils to approach neutral pHs. But both bacteria, Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter, they are using this as a source of energy. And these are very iconic microbes because the father of soil microbiology, Sergei Winogradsky, he was the one who first described these chemolithotrophs in soil. The next process is denitrification. Once you move from ammonium into nitrates and nitrates, then you can lose these nitrates and nitrates into the atmosphere by anaerobic microbes. These anaerobic microbes are using the nitrates and nitrates as electron acceptors in anaerobic respiration process. And in this process, it takes the oxygen for their respiration process and then releases N2 back into the atmosphere. One of the important things about this denitrification process is that part of this denitrification renders nitrous oxides, which are greenhouse gases. So they're really important now if you're talking about climate change, that this denitrification is carrying out this process. These microbes are carrying out denitrification in anaerobic conditions. So you want to avoid having anaerobic soils, because this will lead to nitrous oxides emission and losses of nitrogen from the soil. So in the resume, again, the nitrogen cycle, it has this movement from the atmospheric nitrogen into the soil environment by both biological nitrogen fixation or industrial nitrogen fixation and fertilizer application. Once the nitrogen is on the soil, the two bioavailable forms are ammonium or nitrates. Yeah? The plants can absorb these nitrates and ammonium, and this process is called assimilation. The plants and animals that eat those plants can then die, and this organic matter can be cycled back into ammonium through the process of nitrogen mineralization, also known as ammonification process. And this cycle in the soil can continue for quite a long time until this nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere by denitrification, ammonium volatilization, or nitrate leaching from this environment. So this is the first part of the nitrogen, soil nitrogen lecture. And the next part I will talk to you about fertilizer management and nitrogen fertility in soils.